Okay, so welcome everybody. There should be more people due to join, but we'll make a start. So a couple of bits of housekeeping to begin with. First of all, Amy Whitehead is away this evening and Jenny Cody is with West Ham United this evening and they have a match. So I am stepping in the hosting duties. I am Andy from Sequoia Books. We published Myths of Sport Coaching. And so the format for this evening is we'll have a 20-minute talk from Andy and Liz, and there will be opportunity to ask questions. If you want to put any questions in the chat box, feel free to do that, and then we can go through them at the end. So in terms of the actual session itself, this is based on chapter 11 of Myths of Sport Coaching, which is common sport and exercise nutrition myths encountered by coaches and athletes. We're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Liz Mahon and Dr. Andy Sparks, two of the three authors of the chapter. We have to be slightly aware that Liz's voice is not at prime capacity this evening, so she does have an excuse if she is whispering a little bit, and maybe we'll ask Andy to answer more of the questions depending on how Liz's voice holds up. But yeah, so we will kick off and then put any questions in the chat box and we'll go through those at the end. So over to you, Andy and Liz.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Andy. We'll start off with some brief introductions from Liz and myself, and then we'll get cracking with a fairly brief overview of really the chapter and some of the key information which has kind of led to the inclusion of the things that we put into the chapter. There's quite a few other things that we could have done. Anyway, so we'll start off with an intro for me, given that I'm chatting already. My name, as Andy said, is Dr. Andy Sparks. I'm a reader in exercise physiology with a specialism in sport and exercise nutrition, and I'm at Edge Hill University. And my interests really, research-wise, are in both macronutrient manipulations, but principally in acute exercise and sport nutrition manipulations, looking at exercise performance. And that often is really to do with endurance exercise in particular, particularly cycling. So over to you, Liz.
Yeah, apologies about the voice, but hopefully you can all hear me. So I'm Dr. Liz Mahon and I work as a senior lecturer in sports nutrition at Liverpool John Moores University. My main interests from a research perspective, but also practitioner perspective, are in endurance sport, particularly ultra endurance sport, and dietary assessment. So I work quite a lot with triathletes and ultra runners. So obviously a lot of our expertise and some of the examples we'll be talking about today are from that endurance world, but we've also used evidence from across a range of other sports when developing this chapter as well. So we will discuss some of that too. So that's me.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So we'll move on. I seem to have drawn on the screen, which is not very helpful. Onwards. Hopefully that's changed. Can everyone see the fact I've drawn on the screen?
Yeah.
I have no idea how to change it, I'm afraid. We'll just have to go with the blue lines, I'm afraid. Yeah, the erase button won't work for me, so we'll crack on. Anyway, apologies, Liz. Okay, so really the chapter itself was a tricky one for us to write, and the main reasons for that were not that the topics that we chose were particularly not necessarily difficult to write about. What was difficult in terms of writing a chapter is that this is a massive topic. It's a huge topic, so not only did we have to rein ourselves in terms of the amount that we covered on each of the myths that we selected, but it was really quite tricky to get ourselves down to what ended up being 7 myths. I think we started with a target of 10, realised we couldn't do that, and then we reduced the number further. We could really have written quite a number of additional myths, and that's because the topic of nutrition, both nutrition generally, but in particular in sport and exercise nutrition, there are many myths that abound, and that's due to a multitude of reasons. And it would be fairly remiss of me to not mention the impact that social media has had on the proliferation of some of these myths. Some of them are potentially based on some fact, but nutrition is also a topic which has some quite inconvenient truths associated with it. And it's often seen sometimes as something that's the easiest thing to manipulate, when in actual fact, it doesn't always work out that way. Okay, the other thing is that I guess one of the reasons why we were approached to write the chapter was purely because if any of you are coaches or practitioners or athletes, you'll realise that often it's the coach which becomes one of the first ports of call in seeking out expertise as to with regards to which information sources might be used, or they might well be the first port of call for advice for particular nutrition strategies. So we also know that some work which has been kind of done off and on from the late 90s onwards shows that in some cases coaches' knowledge could be a bit better, and that's not me having a go at coaches for being remiss in their duties, but the reality is that the nutrition topic itself is so vast that it's very difficult to keep on top of absolutely everything. And it's one of the reasons why sport and exercise nutrition practitioners have become much more commonplace in particularly elite sport settings, and that's because of the complexities of dealing with that on top of having to coach athletes as well. So it becomes quite awkward. And I guess that, you know, one of the key take-home messages is that you shouldn't be hard on yourself as a practitioner if you're a coach or an athlete, because you really shouldn't be expected to know absolutely everything. It's fairly easy to upskill. The difficult bit is picking the right information to upskill with, and that is obviously one of the things that Liz and I teach our undergraduate students is that the information that's available is vast, and the tricky thing is to weed out the information which is potentially misleading or bogus, and work out the stuff which is evidence-based or evidence-informed. Those two things are quite the same, but you know, we'll try to use that approach in our scientific work, and that's how we would try to work as practitioners as well. So there are some simple rules that you should be able to pick out of some of the content that we go through this evening. So fingers crossed that'll work, and apologies again for the blue lines. Okay, which seem determined to hang around. Anyway, I'm a novice with Zoom, I'm afraid. Okay, so we'll go on to the first myth, and I'm gonna deal with this one. And the first myth that we included was this idea that fluid intake demands are the same for everyone, and this is in part based on this idea that you know, not necessarily with athletes, but in normal individuals, we often see this silly rule of you must consume 8 glasses of fluid a day, or you must have at least 2 litres of fluid a day, and that's not necessarily based on anything in particular, and it's obviously going to be very much dependent on how big your glass is if you're going to do this based on the size of glasses. So that's obviously quite tricky. But the reality is that this is a highly individualized requirement. So your individualized fluid intake needs are vastly different, or they're likely to be, to somebody else. It very much depends on you as an individual. And the reason for that is that obviously body size, so body surface area, muscle mass will have an impact potentially on your fluid requirements, because that will obviously generate heat when you're active. But your biological sex has an impact, because males typically have more sweat glands than females. The training status of the individual will often have an impact, and this is something that you might have noticed yourself if you've ever had a layoff from training. You might find that after a good few weeks of either injury caused inactivity or just a reduction in activity, when you go back to exercising, it will typically take you a bit longer to get to notice that you're really becoming sweaty, and that can vary quite quickly. And the reason for that is that the eccrine sweat glands, which are responsible for responding to changes in core temperature, they're trainable, and so the onset of sweating typically will take place a little quicker. And they'll be a little bit more enthusiastic as well, the more training that you do. Likewise, the volume of training that you do, so the total amount of time and the intensity will also have an impact. And obviously, the hotter that you get when you do that activity, the more stimulation there will be for the need for evaporative heat losses. And the environment obviously coincides with that. So not just warm environments, but also potentially altitude differences. So at higher altitudes, you see increased fluid needs because of drier air, but also, because of drier air. So you see evaporative heat losses go up, and you see heat losses through increased respiration and also fluid losses through that mechanism too. And then there are seasonal variations. So you know, if you're training regularly, you might well notice that the onset of sweating and the type of sweating that you do in terms of the sodium content of it is also likely to be different based on the environmental changes that you see across one season to the next. So in the UK at the moment, in the north of England, we haven't perhaps had this, but in the south of England, we've had some quite high temperatures. We had 2 days in the northwest, and it became for a couple of days pretty insufferably hot. And you'll notice that if you exercise in that sort of environment, then your fluid losses are also going to be much higher. The other thing that we mentioned along these lines is, and the reasons why fluid intake, particularly in preparation for exercise, is so important, is that we are quite keen to encourage adequate hydration, especially before the start of exercise. And there's this really nice simple, well-controlled study by Peacock et al. In 2011, where they simply looked at people's self-chosen volumes of activity and their enjoyment and their relative ratings of fatigue in either a dehydrated or an adequately hydrated status, and showed that the hypohydrated or dehydrated prior to exercise rated the exercise less enjoyable, they did less, and they also found that it was slightly more fatiguing. And then the other thing that in the next myth was that water is the most effective rehydration fluid, and this was based again on this multi-center trial that was led by Ron Mahon, and they compared these 13 drinks to this beverage hydration index, where they used still water as a beverage hydration index value of 1, and then subsequently compared the relative merits of hydration ability of these drinks, different solutions, and compared them to still water. And you can see the lovely asterisks, which represent statistically significant differences. So unsurprisingly, we've got one of the largest hydration index responses from an oral rehydration solution. So in this case, that was diarrhea. And then the other two statistically significantly better drinks were actually full fat and skim milk, and the simple reasons for those are that they have carbohydrate, they have a bit of protein, so they have an increased calorific value, they have electrolytes in them and water, and so that can speed up the transit of fluids through the gut. Okay. At that point, keeping the lovely lines on the page, I'm going to hand over to Liz. Oops.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm going to take you through a few myths that we decided to focus on when thinking about kind of the macronutrients. So a question I often get asked from athletes, but also non-athletes, in fact, is around how much carbohydrate, protein, fat should I be eating? And the optimum combination of these macros is often subject to much debate, particularly amongst athletes. And as a result, this has kind of led to many myths about the volume and type of each of these we should be consuming for both optimal performance, but also in terms of body composition as well. So over the next few slides, I'll try and kind of cover some of these. So this first one is athletes should consume carbohydrate at a set percentage of energy intake. So for a long time, a high carbohydrate diet was considered the most important strategy for performance in a lot of different sports. And so guidelines were developed along the range of about 60 to 70% of our energy that we're taking in should be coming from carbohydrates. However, those guidelines were kind of the early 90s. Now we know much more. So a lot of sports nutrition research has really kind of taken off since then. And we know much more about metabolic pathways, the energy demands of different sports, and in fact, the energy demands of different training sessions. So the table that's up here on the slide here is guidelines from the American College of Sports Medicine. And what they've now done is, what we now do is express these carbohydrate intake recommendations relative to body weight. So rather than a percentage of energy intake. So you can see, depending on the activity and the training intensity, we have different guided recommendations. So for light or low intensity skill-based activities, around 3 to 5 grams per kilogram per day, going up to kind of extreme commitment, high intensity exercise for many hours over a day, looking at more like 8 to 12 grams per kilogram per day. So this is good, a good basis to work from. So if you are working with athletes, however, what's important to note is it does need to be individualized. So if I'm working with athletes, yes, I'd use this as a guideline. But for example, if I've got athletes who are trying to lose weight, then their overall energy intake may well be lower. So therefore, their carbohydrate intake may need to be a little lower. I also, as I mentioned, work with endurance athletes, and often, they're doing intense endurance programs and they're exercising at high intensity for, sometimes several times a day. So according to this, their intake should be very high, but trying to consume regularly, that kind of 6 to 10, 8 to 12 grams per kilogram per day can be very difficult. And some people struggle to tolerate that kind of GI wise. So what I'd look to do is try and increase people's intakes slightly, particularly over those higher days. Many of the athletes I work with, often when I first see them, they might be consuming more around that 3 to 5 grams per kilogram per day. And there's often lots of, which I'll talk about in a minute, issues around carbohydrates. So trying to encourage people to increase their intake of those. And that's so that you can really fuel those high intensity sessions, because carbohydrates are high intensity fuel. But then equally on days which they're doing light exercise or rest days, then you can lower the carbohydrate and focus more around kind of high quality protein, getting those essential fatty acids in as well. So essentially what we're trying to do is periodize our nutrition and carbohydrate availability alongside training. So it's definitely not as straightforward as consuming a set percentage of energy intake. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So the second area we wanted to cover is around athletes need to avoid carbohydrate to lose weight. So low carbohydrates diets have been used kind of for a long time for weight loss. So things like the Atkins diet, ketogenic diets, where people are consuming very little carbs, high amounts of protein and fat. And the idea behind that is fats and proteins keep you feeling fuller for longer. They can help reduce your appetite and therefore can promote successful weight loss. However, there's been many studies performed over the years, and actually the evidence is very inconclusive around whether ketogenic, so low carbohydrate diets are actually kind of successful in a athletic population or more successful over other types of diets. What you'll see on this slide here, which is taken from My Sport Science, which is a website developed by a leading professor in exercise physiology and sports nutrition, Asker Joikendrup, and he has created this slide. And basically, so I've pitched it, but basically it's showing that, you know, whatever diet we're going to use, essentially how it works is by creating a calorie deficit. So whether that's low carb or whether that's low fat, that's essentially what we're trying to do. What we've got to remember in athletes is that carbohydrates are important for our high intensity exercise. So they're our primary fuel. And there is lots and lots and lots of research that suggests, particularly in endurance sport, that carbohydrate is linked to better performance. So we do need to be careful about avoiding carbohydrates to lose weight. Another reason for this is if we are trying to lose weight by restricting a particular nutrient, then we're more likely to become deficient in other vitamins and minerals. So for example, in some of our carbohydrate sources, there'll be like B vitamins, fiber, that's really important for our gut health, that if we reduce our intake of carbohydrate too much, we might lose some of those, which again could impact on our health and also performance as well. So what we generally guidance around losing weight is to advise for quite a low energy deficit, so something around 250 to 500 calories per day. One thing that is really important to note, though, is we've got to be really careful around weight loss, particularly in athletes. In the past, there's been lots of, you know, and we're still hearing stories of you know, athletes been told that they need to lose weight, and there's lots of cases of disordered eating, and not only can that impact on performance but also health as well. So it is an area to be really careful with, and therefore I would suggest that if you're unsure about how the athlete will respond or unsure what advice to give, then definitely seek support with this area. You'll notice in the bottom right hand corner of this slide, we've got a link to further guidance relating to relative energy deficiency in sport. So I'm not sure if you've heard of REDS, but this is definitely something that's not uncommon in athletes, particularly athletes of aesthetic sports or sports like cycling, triathletes, runners, where low body weight is potentially an advantage. So we often see these athletes trying to lose weight, and more often or not, this is often done by trying to restrict carbohydrates. Not always carbohydrates, sometimes it's just energy, energy as a whole, but often we see it where athletes become restrictive. And what this can do is if there's a mismatch between our energy intake and our energy expenditure, and we have not enough energy, then this can lead to insufficient energy to cover our basic physiological demands. So this can have an effect on things like our endocrine system, which is responsible for producing our hormones. And these are key drivers of health, but also driving positive adaptations to exercise. So if we're low in energy, this can downregulate our hormones, and that can then have an effect on things like our immune system. So we might see more illnesses, bone health, performance, body composition, so a whole range of factors. So this is an area that we do need to be really careful about in terms of how we advise athletes around weight loss, and particularly watching out for things like restricting carbohydrates. And I think particularly in, for example, cyclists, obviously the Tour de France has just been on, and a lot of those athletes are very lean, and then we might get recreational amateur cyclists thinking that they need to be leaner in order to perform, but forgetting the fact that and then we hear stories, on social media about some of these athletes being low carb, but they're not low carb all the time, and that's what's really important. They might have days where they are, but to fuel those big rides, those big sessions, they need to be eating high amounts of carbohydrates. And so, and those athletes are getting that nutritional support to make sure they're exactly bang on what they need. Whereas for athletes that haven't got that support, that's when we often see kind of people slipping into restricting carbohydrates too much and potentially getting into that relative energy deficiency. Thank you. Okay, so the next myth, focusing on moving away from carbohydrate and looking at protein. So whilst many people are trying to reduce carbohydrates, many people think that more protein is better. So another question that I typically get asked a lot about is, how much protein should I be eating? If I eat a big steak at dinner, will that result in bigger biceps by breakfast time? So it's not always the case. Protein, we need it for growth, repair, recovery, training adaptations. We need it for our immune function, potentially a fuel as well. In the general population, we have recommendations around 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. And because of these extra demands of exercise and the muscle adaptation, then athletes do typically need more than the sedentary population. The amount for athletes that we think is generally sufficient, and obviously it depends on the sport and the type of athlete, but it's around 1.4 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day. So that should be sufficient. Endurance athletes normally around 1.4 to 1.6 or 1.8, and then perhaps strength athletes a bit higher, 1.8 to 2.2. But what is and what we see is that many people actually do meet those targets. But what's more important is, or is as important, is the timing and also the quality of the protein intake. So I've done studies with footballers in the past where we've looked at their macronutrient intake, and we see that generally their protein intake is fine, but it's often skewed. So we typically see quite low intakes in the morning, and then the large amount of that protein being consumed at dinner time. So they're meeting those daily requirements, but it's sort of not optimal for muscle protein synthesis. So each time you ingest protein, there's a corresponding spike in muscle protein synthesis. And so what we're ideally trying to do is over a day, and particularly after training sessions, is making sure we have good quality protein regularly so that we can maximize that muscle protein synthesis. So I'll just talk you through some of the graphs on this slide here. So the one on the left-hand side is a typical, there's been a number of studies like this, and this is a typical study that has resulted in some of the recommendations we have, so that after exercise, we should be consuming about 20 to 25 grams of high quality protein. So by high quality, we mean, so for example, whey protein, a protein that contains all of our essential amino acids. I've just seen a question up there, FSR. So on the y-axis there, that is our basically our muscle protein synthesis rate. That's what we're measuring there on the y-axis. So along the x-axis, we've got the dose of whey protein that's been given. So in a lot of these protein-based studies, what happens is they get a load of athletes, often recreational athletes, into a lab, and they get them to often these are done on like leg press or leg extension studies, so whereby they will exercise one leg and then not necessarily exercise the other leg, and then they will take they will immediately after that exercise, after they've done a number of reps, they will take a dose of whey protein. So in this particular study, they either had no whey protein, 10 grams, 20 grams or 40 grams, and then after that they'll take a muscle biopsy and measure the muscle protein synthesis rate. So what we can see is that in the in the black columns there, so the exercised leg, after they've consumed that whey protein, we can see that there's a dose response. So as we increase the dose of whey, the muscle protein synthesis rate is higher. The stars represent statistical significance. So you can see as we increase the dose, it goes up from 0 to 10 to 20, but then between 20 and 40, there's not, compared to the amount of extra protein you're having, there's not as additional benefit on top of it. So these type of studies led to the recommendation that we probably need around 20 to 25 grams post-exercise. If you then have a look at the graph on the right-hand side, this is a more recent study. So lots of these earlier studies were just performed in kind of like the one muscle group. What this study did was look at larger muscle groups and whole body workouts. And what we found in this one was actually there is an improvement in muscle protein synthesis if with 40 grams, if we're looking at engaging these larger muscle groups or if we're training a whole body. So this has led to recommendations that, depending on the training session, the exercise you're doing, then really we need to be consuming a high quality source of protein between 20 to 40 grams after exercise, but ideally kind of at regular intervals throughout the day, about every 3 to 4 hours. So I guess the key message is that it's not just about quality, it's not just about quantity, but it's about high quality space throughout the day with a good dose. It's not always the case that more protein is better. If we take more than that, so if you're consuming more than that 20 to 40 gram dose, then, or more than your daily recommendation, then that protein's not going to further stimulate muscle protein synthesis or result in bigger muscles. It's essentially going to lead to potentially unnecessary energy intake. Or indeed, it might be taking the place of other important nutrients like the carbohydrate. So we need to make sure that we're not consuming just too much protein. Okay. So the final myth we covered with regards to macronutrients and protein was whether protein supplements are essential for all athletes. So these days, protein powders and bars, the market for those is huge. Pretty much all products now are available in a high protein kind of format. So as coaches or as nutritionists, people working with athletes, should we be recommending protein supplements? I just wanted to show you this graph here. And this is from the Food and Agricultural Organization. This is data, global data, looking at protein intake. So this came from a study looking at basically sustainability around protein sources. But so it's not from a sports nutrition study or anything, but it just shows that across the world, particularly in Western areas, that our average protein requirement is above that recommended. So the black horizontal line that's going through there is the average daily protein requirement, but that it is important to note that that's for the sedentary population. So that's our 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day. So as I mentioned before, in athletes, we're recommending more around the 1.4, 1.6 to 2 grams. So obviously we're potentially looking more around that kind of 80 upwards grams per day. In that case, we know that athletes need more than the general population, but we're still finding that, particularly in the UK and other countries, we are generally able to meet those recommendations by whole foods, so not having to use supplements. However, that said, when we're considering supplements, we need to think about some of the issues I talked about on the slide before. So one thing we need to think about is timing throughout the day and also the quality of the protein. So if you've got athletes that are out about, they've got busy lives, they've got a training session, then they're moving on to something else, then it's not always feasible to consume a protein-rich meal. And so things like protein shakes can be very beneficial because they're convenient, they're practical to take with you, and we know they've got a good quality protein within them. particularly for athletes following restricted diets or perhaps vegan athletes, where it can be more difficult to get your requirement for an athlete through plant-based protein. Then it might be that, again, having protein supplements is beneficial for that. In terms of like one, a myth that we didn't really go into that we initially considered was around talking about plant-based foods and vegan nutrition. And obviously it's an area that's being researched a lot currently, because there's not actually that much information around kind of the effectiveness of plant-based sources of protein supplements versus your typical kind of whey protein. And it's likely that people following a plant-based diet would benefit from taking supplements, but taking a mixture of different ones. So for example, pea proteins and rice proteins, because the problem with plant sources is they don't always contain all of our essential amino acids. So we need to have a variety to make sure we get that full complement. So I guess the take-home messages from this are that by no means are protein supplements essential for all athletes, but depending on training load, energy requirements, and budget, they might well be beneficial. Thank you.
So very quickly, I'm going to deal with the last one, which is sports nutrition supplements are essential for optimal performance. That obviously links quite nicely to some of the comments that Liz has just made with regards to whey protein supplements. And one of the key things I wanted to kind of highlight really is that, that supplements have their place, but they certainly shouldn't be the first port of call for consideration. Really, the first thing to do is consider a supplement across some key factors, and some of those key factors are highlighted in this little algorithm or decision tree, which was developed by Graham Close for the Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register. And it's based on the idea that is your supplement likely to potentially improve performance. And there are an awful lot of supplements, but there aren't a great deal which are, from a performance perspective, are consistently across multiple activities shown to be really that effective in everyone. And there's a good few reasons for that, which I guess are a little beyond the scope of what we're dealing with now. But really the first thing to think about then is it possible to hit the intake requirements? So Liz was mentioning protein previously. Is it possible to manipulate the diet using food to hit those targets? That's one of the key things. If the supplement can't be achieved at the right intake level through food, then quite clearly there's a possibility that you might want to look at a supplement for use to make up that potential deficiency from intake requirements. The next important thing to think about is, particularly if you're dealing with athletes who might be subject to anti-doping tests, is that you must ensure that you are using products, supplements that are not necessarily, that are not foods, but actual supplements. You must ensure that that they are informed sport. If you're in the UK, it's informed sport listed. So that shouldn't just be the sticker on the tub of whatever it is you're taking. It needs to be the sticker on the tub, plus the product needs to be also listed on the Informed Sport website. So that's really important that both of those things happen. And if that isn't the case, then you should not use the product. So this idea of independent batch testing, if you're not in the UK, it might well not be Informed Sport, but there are other national or international organisations which are independently batch testing, depending on what nation you're in. And then the other thing is that just to highlight this, that there are some key useful bits of information with regard to taking supplements, or if you're working with athletes, that it's important to make sure that you're aware of what your responsibilities are with regards to the intake of substances, really. So This is just to kind of to highlight the UK Anti-Doping Agency's Protecting Sport initiative, looking at through the Clean Sport Hub, where there's a couple of free qualifications or courses which you can do in order to upskill slightly. But the really key take-home message is that, you know, that some supplements really do have their place. Now, Liz mentioned as well carbohydrate, and I guess along with whey protein, carbohydrate is often a supplement which is used extensively, certainly during exercise, in particular in the exercise that Liz and I are both interested in, but also in team sport performance. You know, we've got exercise longer than about 45 minutes or an hour, then quite obviously there's the potential for carbohydrate supplementation to be potentially useful for performance. So it's something that could be considered in that sort of environment. And then just some take-home messages, and they are that really there's quite a lot of these issues are fairly common sense. So we've highlighted some common sense issues and some potential targets, but even though you have those, it's not quite as simplistic as, oh, we'll just hit this percentage target for a macronutrient. One of the key things that we didn't necessarily cover, although Liz mentioned this idea of calorie deficit, and that is actually working out what energy intake is and energy requirements are for an individual is a really quite difficult thing to measure very precisely. And so some of this stuff really needs to be done on a trial and error basis. It's all very well, you know, using software to determine precise nutrient intakes. But we know that when you use diet diaries, for instance, in order to assess what somebody's eating, they have a tendency not to give you the whole truth. And so that can be quite tricky sometimes in determining exactly what someone's eating. And so if you're looking for quite small calorie deficits, that too is quite a tricky thing to do. And it brings us back, I guess, that one of the major outcomes that we would be expecting to see from any sort of dietary manipulation, chronic dietary manipulation, would be a changing body composition, and that's typically how we work out with success in some cases of our manipulations. Another thing is that if you're not sure, you know, don't be embarrassed. It's fine to say I don't know. It's fine to say I don't know, but I'll find somebody that does know and I'll ask them. You know, you can't be an expert in absolutely everything, and if someone tells you that they are, you should be fairly skeptical about that. That happens within areas, but certainly it happens across multiple areas of expertise. The other thing is that if you're going to look for specific advice, then ideally start with somebody who's suitably qualified, or somebody who has a good track record from a research perspective on a similar topic. If you're looking for a practitioner in particular, then the Sport and Exercise Nutrition Registered list is a good place to start for that. We mentioned this idea about being careful with body mass. Some athletes really don't like that being measured. That can get us a little hamstrung, because as you'll have seen, that, you know, some of the techniques that we're interested in and that can be very practically administered are often very much based on this idea of grams per kilo, or looking at body mass changes over time, even if it's a short period of time, to work out fluid requirements. You know, this idea of measuring body mass can be a very useful tool, but it's a sensitive area for some individuals, so be careful. And then this idea of manipulating acute nutrition strategies. So again, this comes back to this idea of, if you're going to do some exercise and you come across this brilliant new supplement and you've been through the schematic and it all looks fantastic, never try that for the first time in an event or a competition, because things will not necessarily work out too well. Always try these things in training wherever possible. And then also another plug for the UK anti-doping courses, the coach specific one, but also the clean sport one. And that's us. So we'll just move to the last slide, which is onto the Q&A.
Thanks, Will. So we do have a question in the chat from Neil, who asks, is it a bad thing if you consume too much protein?
So I guess I'll take that one. So I guess one of the final things I said on the protein slide when I was talking about that was, if you take too much, it won't be used for muscle adaptation and promoting muscle protein synthesis, but it'll essentially be excess energy, which could then be stored as fat. There are some concerns around kind of very high protein diets, looking at kind of higher than 3 grams per kilogram per day, and there has led to belief among some that might cause things like have harmful effects on like kidney and liver function. But a lot of the evidence for that has come from, or the worry about that rather, has come from research that's been done on has not been done on athletic populations, so it's been done on patients. So when we look at an actual healthy athletic population, there's not really any evidence as such to suggest that there's any particular dangers with those high protein intakes. But what we were saying before is that, you know, for athletes, and in order to get a balanced diet that's going to support that training and performance, is that you don't want to be having too much of any one thing.
Yeah, just to add into that, there's a study which was done a couple of years ago by Jose Antonio's group in the States, and they gave 3 grams per kilo per day protein diet for a year, and showed absolutely no impact whatsoever on any kidney or liver function issues. So Liz is right, you know, that there might be an issue in terms of you consuming more calories than you might need, potentially. But in terms of there being a negative impact on health in an athletic population, it's unlikely, but there's no point consuming stuff that you don't actually need.
Okay, so we have another question from Johnny, who says, if you're advising parents on their child's diet, say 14 and up, what advice would you give to steer away from removing foods from their diet?
Go on, Liz, I'll let you have this one.
I think it's the most important thing for kind of obviously adolescents is trying to establish good eating practices, and not to go around, like we were mentioning before, around that restrictive eating, because that's what's potentially dangerous and can potentially lead to disordered eating. So it's about encouraging trying lots of different foods, lots of variety. When they are 14, obviously, not only are they training and potentially doing quite a lot of training, but they're also going through growth and development. So it's really important they're getting enough energy, enough protein, enough carbohydrate to support that development. But also at that time in life, your vitamin and mineral, things like iron, calcium, your requirements of certain vitamins and minerals and nutrients are higher than they are at any other stage in life. And obviously it's a stage in life where children have got they start to get control of their own diet and peer pressure. So it's a really important time to kind of focus on nutrition, to try and establish some of those healthy practices, and yeah, try not to restrict things, even things like treats. You know, all foods, there aren't any bad foods. Like, all foods will have a place. So, you know, things like sweets, they can be useful if you're, you know, training and you need that carbohydrate intake. So I think it's about trying to talk to them about that, and yeah, definitely not getting into the restrictive. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Andy.
As somebody with a 13-year-old daughter, I can empathise entirely. It's quite tricky to encourage kids of that age to do the right thing. I mentioned social media earlier as well. They get some harebrained ideas at times, things like TikTok about what might or Snapchat about what might or might not be the most appropriate approach. It's a difficult one because, you know, you really want to use an evidence-based approach. So talking from my kind of own personal experiences here, you want to use an evidence-based approach, but kids aren't interested in evidence at all. They can't kind of rationalize why that's important. And really Liz's first point of try not to restrict particular foods, but have a wide variety. So go with the most colourful looking plate of food that you can possibly get away with. And again, that is really tricky, because that's the approach that I would want to take with my kids. But, you know, there was a while when my daughter would only eat anything that was beige. You know, the closest we got to vegetables was chickpeas, because they were beige. You know, it really is quite tricky. So I can empathise, but it can be just a trial and error issue, and see what they like. Try and sneak foods in that are different, or disguise them. That's a strategy which we've tried. We've also tried lying about what's in a dish in order to get nutrients in. It's a minefield, practically very difficult. I appreciate that.
All right, another question from Neil. Is there a particular time to consume carbs during the day, or could you consume any amount, anytime, as long as you're getting the right amount of carbs for the day? That's in brackets for athletes.
Go on, I'll have a go with this then. Okay, so we use a phrase often called fuel for the work required. So it will depend on the timing of and the nature of exercise. It will depend on what has previously been done and whether or not you are exercising twice in a day. So that can have an impact on the timing of carbohydrate intake. Obviously, if you're training twice, you want to make sure that the second bout of exercise you're adequately refueled for, particularly if it's, you know, an intense bout of exercise, or if it's, you know, moderate or prolonged. You want to make sure that that's the case. If there's a gap of around 8 hours or so, you probably don't need to worry too much. But in the period before, immediately after exercise, if you're doing 2 bouts, high glycemic index food, so simple carbohydrates, would be probably the way to go in order to resynthesize glycogen stores as quickly as possible. The with athletes, or in athletes brackets is interesting. You know, again, it will depend on what phase of training they're in. You know, we use this phrase, periodized nutrition. So is it off season? Is it in the middle of the season? Is it, you know, in a competitive phase? There'll be slight differences there based on the volumes and the intensities of the exercise which is happening. If it was a sedentary population, you might encourage them not to constantly consume, because you're going to increase blood glucose concentrations all the time. You're going to increase insulin responses to that glucose intake. And so if you're trying to use up fat potentially in the periods outside of exercise, having high blood glucose all the time, it is not a good idea, because it's likely that you'll be reducing the level of fat oxidation throughout the day by having high glucose concentrations. Again, in an athletic population, I'm not aware of studies which have really considered that in terms of, you know, the goals that you're after. If it was weight loss, or if it was to optimize training, I think they're two completely different questions, really. So, you know, that it will very much depend on the context. Personally, I would, you know, I'd be timing the carbohydrate intake immediately before, depending on the activity, potentially during, depending on the type of activity. So, and then immediately afterwards, and then if at all possible, leave some time between. If you don't need to refuel quickly for another bout of exercise, leave some time between meals. Don't be constantly consuming carbs.
Okay, we will go with one final question from Johnny, and he asks, if you were part of a brand new sports academy, what 3 things would you include in a coach training course?
Your turn.
My voice is gone.
Oh, yeah.
Hang on, I'm just gonna have a little think. 3 top tips. So I think, I guess it would have to be around watching out for people restricting foods, something that we've kind of talked a reasonable amount about today. The other one is, as kind of Andy mentioned before, is trying to get variety. I think often athletes are kind of creatures of habit, and they like to have the same things day in and day out. You know, if they feel something works, then have it, but that can often limit the variety of foods we're having, and then that is more likely to affect things like the amount of vitamins and minerals they're taking in the diet. And Andy, I'll let you do the third one.
I would go for some nutrition training seminars for the athletes and the coaches. I think that would be a really useful thing. And that should not just be, you know, some scientists talking about it. It should be practitioners and ideally teamed up with chefs. So you see this sort of technique used at the English Institute of Sport, where they combine expertise of the applied practitioner along with the person who's actually going to have to deliver the food. So I think doing that would be quite useful, and getting the athlete to upskill in terms of food preparation and what to eat and when to eat. So simple practical skills like how to shop well, because often people make really poor choices when they go to the supermarket. Rule number one, never shop hungry, that sort of thing. And the first thing, obviously, would be, and you see this with practitioners often do this, is they'll take their athlete shopping and say, right, this is the type of meal, what would you buy? And then talk them through that idea of what would be useful. Could you substitute one thing for another that might be a better option? And, you know, that sort of practical skill, because in certain circumstances, like football academies, it's possible to deliver quite a number of meals to athletes, but that isn't the case for all sports, and really mistakes potentially could be made not in the applied setting. It's when athletes go home, particularly if they're young athletes. If meals are provided for them by their parents, then we've seen this across multiple nutritional initiatives, not necessarily in sport, but in terms of normal nutrition. We're providing some form of upskilling of how to eat well for the people who are providing the meals. So the family members might also be a useful thing to do. We've seen this with some elite footballers that we worked for with in an under-21 academy, and at training they ate well. Outside of training, where they were in that normal home environment, they were provided with the foods, as Liz said, based on that sort of creature of habit or habitus type approach, often by their parents. And if their parents weren't sure about what to give them, they would just usually go with that normal family tradition of what was eaten on a Wednesday or a Thursday, for instance. And that obviously can lead to suboptimal fueling and recovery, depending on the exercise which has been done or is about to be done.
Okay, so thank you so much for that. We'll wrap up there. First of all, we'll wrap up with a huge thank you to Liz and Andy for what was a really, really interesting talk. And I'd encourage everyone to read the chapter they've written as well, that expands a lot on what was discussed today. It's an absolutely brilliant chapter, and we're delighted to have it within the book. Thank you to all of you for attending. It will be up on YouTube in the next couple of days. Please do share it. That the whole point of this book and these talks is to get the most credible information out there in those areas that have a lot of information that maybe isn't quite as credible. So the more a talk like this is shared, the more we can get the right information out there. So thank you again. We will have another session next month. That session is from chapter 15 of the book, which is from Laura Swettenham, Kristen McGinty Minister, and Stuart Bicker. And they'll be talking about the evolving role of the sports psychologist and the myth that their sole role is to fix athletes. So we hope to see you all there as well. And thank you very much for your time. And thanks again to Liz and Andy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.